Over the past couple of weeks, almost 2 months, we've been going through these different relationships that we have throughout our lives and how we can be great at them. Relationships are hard. I don't know about you, but sometimes they can be hard for me. And I think a lot of the reasons why relationships are difficult for most of us is because we can only control one person, right? And that one person we control is who? Ourselves, right? We can control how we think about certain things. We can control how we react in certain situations. We can, to some extent, control what we feel when things are going on. But in a relationship, there is not just one person. All right, one person is not a relationship. There's at least two, if not more. And so so you're adding this completely different person who more often times than not thinks differently than you do, feels differently than you do, and reacts to things differently than you do. And so you can only control yourselves, and so that's what makes relationships difficult, is that second person. If there's just one person in the world, life would be easy, wouldn't it? We think that, don't we? I remember hurting a friend of mine. I didn't mean to, but I want to share this story just to kind of illustrate how difficult relationships can be. She was a friend of mine, and I remember walking in on Sunday morning one time, and she was there, and she had put on a lot more eyeshadow than she normally did, and the first thing out of my mouth was, "Wow, there's a lot of makeup on today." And it wasn't that it looked bad. Let me clarify. It wasn't that it looked bad. She did look good, and it wasn't that I was trying to hurt her. It was just the first thing that came out of my mouth because that's how I reacted. And she was kind of hurt by that, you can imagine, right? She went to the bathroom. She washed most of it off. And later on, after finding out that she had done that, I felt bad for causing that reaction inside of her. So relationships are difficult. All right, they take work, and so we want to be able to have a relationship that's not just not hurting people, but relationships that are building other people up. And so we've looked at some of these. How can we be great parents? How can we be great grandparents? How can we be great friends and spouses? Today we want to look at the last relationship, and it's an important one, but it's not one we often think about. And that is, how can we be great enemies? Of all the other relationships we've been talking about, they're relationships we enjoy, right? I would hope at least, we typically enjoy being parents. We typically enjoy having friends. All right? But when it comes to enemies, it doesn't usually... Not something we usually are excited about. At least I hope you're not excited about having an enemy. Enemies are difficult people to deal with. And throughout the Bible, there is a variety of enemies that pop up. Different people have different enemies that come against them. Both the Old Testament and in the New Testament, the faithful men and women of God had enemies that came into their lives. And if we are faithful to God's calling in our lives, then we too will have enemies. And it should not surprise us. Peter writes in 1 Peter 4 these words, "Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when His glory is revealed." What Peter says here is you should not be surprised when enemies rise up against you. You should not be surprised when you face difficult situations from people. Instead, you should do what? Rejoice. You should rejoice that you have been counted worthy to face the same trials that Jesus faced. And so if we are following Jesus and are faithfully committed to Him, there will be trials, there will be enemies. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we reflect Jesus in the eyes of our enemies? The greatest example of enemies that I can think of that comes from the Bible comes from the story of David and Saul. These two guys, they were enemies at the very end. And I think that David's reaction to Saul is one that we can emulate in our lives. If we want to be great enemies, we just need to reflect what David did. Saul was the king over Israel. He was anointed by Samuel. He is the first official king of Israel. And he did some things that he was not supposed to do. All right, God had said, don't do these things, and Saul did them, despite what God had said. And because of that, God said, okay, your family is no longer going to be king. I am choosing someone else that will replace you eventually. And that person that God chose was David. Now, Saul didn't know this. All right, Saul was not aware of this. If Saul had known this, he probably really would have killed David right on the spot. All right, so he wasn't aware of this, but the entire, he was aware that God was displeased with him. And because he knew that God was displeased and that he was going to choose a new king, it became kind of this suspicious nature of Saul. All right, Saul became very suspicious of people that got praise. So when David became a general in Saul's army and he started winning all these battles, one of the things that happened as a result of this was the people of Israel began to praise David. In 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 7, we read these praises. They said, as they danced, the people of Israel, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. So these accolades that David gets is a lot higher than Saul. In case you have a problem with math, tens of thousands is greater than thousands. And Saul hears this praise and he becomes very, very jealous. And he will decide that he needs to get rid of David because David might be that guy. He might be that guy that God has chosen, and maybe the success that David has had is because God is on his side. But when you read through chapters 18 through the rest of the book of 1 Samuel, you see that Saul is kind of torn. He's torn on what his relationship to David is. At times he wants to kill him. At other times he's willing to give off his daughter in marriage. And so he's torn on what this looks like. And I think as we look into their story a little bit more, we first have to ask the question, who is our true enemy? Sometimes I think we get into this habit of thinking that people that disagree with us, well, they are our enemies. We've all heard the saying, right? If you're not for me, then you are against me. But is that true? There's a lady on my Facebook page that is 100% for animal rights, if you will. And so every once in a while she'll post a picture of a dog that's been abused, and it'll say something like, share for Fluffy. And they want you to share this so that you know that it's not right to abuse animals. And do you know what I do every time I see that picture on Facebook? I keep scrolling. I do not share it. Now, is it because I think animals should be abused? No. But I'm also not for sharing the picture of Fluffy either. All right, so I'm not for her cause, but does that make me against it? And sometimes I think in our culture we have forgotten this. All right, just because I don't agree with the way you think on this topic doesn't mean you are my enemy. Don brought it up in his meditation earlier, right? We are a divided country, and we've bought into the lie that if you are over here, then you're against me over here. But that's not accurate. Just because I disagree does not mean I am the enemy. And we have to be aware of that. Just because someone disagrees with us doesn't mean they are our enemies. In the Revolutionary War, there were two sides that the colonists fell on. One side was that of the revolutionists, the rebels, those who took up arms and said, we need independence, and they fought against the British. The other side is who we often call the Tories. They were the ones that said, no, we need to remain a part of Britain, and they took up arms and they fought against the rebels. But there's a third group that we often forget about, and it's the group that said, we should not be fighting. We should not be taking up arms. And some of them agreed with the independence side. They said, we need independence, but there's a better way to do it. And some of them agreed with the Tories and said, yes, we need to stay with Britain, but we shouldn't be fighting each other. And you know what happened to that third side? Because they would not fight, they were persecuted by both sides and killed by both the rebels and the Tories. But were they the enemies? See, sometimes we forget that we do truly have an enemy and we get distracted. And so we have to ask the question, who is our true enemy? And if we can figure out who our true enemy is, then we can truly have a great relationship with them, even as an enemy. So who is our true enemy? Today we're going to be in a couple of chapters in 1 Samuel. The first one is going to be chapters 18 and 19. And it's in these chapters that I think we answer the question, who is our enemy? See, the crowds have been celebrating David, and Saul has been kind of hurt by the words that the crowd has proclaimed. And he's become jealous, and he's getting angry. And so we read this in verses 10 through 11. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully upon Saul, and he was prophesying in his house while David was playing the lyre, and as he usually did. And Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Here's what we have to understand. Our true enemy are those that are trying to seek harm for us. They are ones that are seeking to destroy us in some way, shape, or form. Saul, one of the punishments that God gave Saul whenever he turned against God was this evil spirit. And it wasn't, we don't know exactly what it was, but we do understand that it wasn't always there on Saul. This particular day, it happened to come upon Saul. And you will notice that David is in there and he's playing music. See, in the early days that this evil spirit came on Saul, nothing could console him except for music. And so his advisors decided to search the countryside to find somebody who was skillful, who could come in anytime that Saul had a bad day and play him music. And do you know who they chose? A little boy named David. And so even as David's fame has grown, he has continued in this job, in this task. Saul is having a bad day. They call in David. David begins to play, but there's an underlying problem, and the problem is Saul's jealousy. And his jealousy is directed at this man who happens to be playing the lyre for him. And so Saul thinks to himself, I can kill him right here and right now. And enemies, they are seeking our harm. He throws his spear at David. It misses. He picks up a second one. He hurls it again. Saul is intent on killing David, and David is intent on not dying. He eludes Saul twice. Now, this happens, and we think that maybe this is the end of their friendly relationship, but we read in the next couple of verses that as David leaves, Saul comes back to his senses, and he tries to marry his oldest daughter to David. And David refuses. He says, who am I that I can accept such an offer? And so Saul marries off his oldest daughter to someone else. He has a second daughter named Michal, and she, we're told, fell in love with David. And so Saul offers her to David, and Saul's advisors tell David, take this offer. And so David is married to Michal. Now, not everything is okay. Saul is still not okay with David and the praises that is happening in his name. David will go out to fight again. David will again have more success. In fact, in verse 30, we read that the Philistines' commanders continued to go out to battle, and as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known. So what we have here is not only is David good as a general, he is really good. In fact, all of Saul's other generals come nowhere close to where David is at. And David becomes more and more famous. And as David becomes more and more famous, we read in verse 19 that Saul tells his son Jonathan and all of his attendants to kill David. So here's the second thing that distinguish true enemies. True enemies continuously encourage others to harm us as well. See, not only are true enemies seeking our harm, but they encourage others to cause us harm in our lives. And it's not good enough that they try to harm us. It's part of who they are to encourage other people, to bring other people under their wings, to talk bad about you, and to say you need to do something against them. Our enemies that are truly out to get us won't stop with themselves, but will bring others to be on their side. Well, Jonathan hears Saul's command and he goes to his dad and he says, "Dad, don't do this. This isn't right. It's not okay. This shouldn't be how it is." And Saul relents in that moment, listening to his son's wisdom, but the cycle will happen again. In verses 9 through 10 of this chapter, we read these words, "But an evil spirit from the Lord came on Saul as he was sitting in the house with his spear in his hand." And again, David is there playing the lyre, and Saul tries again a third time to pin him to the wall with his spear, but David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. And that night, David made good on his escape. In verse 11, we're told that Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and to kill him in the morning. But David's wife, warned David about it. And so we just see this cycle, right? And this is the third distinguishing mark of a true enemy. After they've failed, they will continue to seek our harm. They don't just stop when they mess up. It's not a one-time try. It's something that they do over and over and over again. And that is what distinguishes an enemy from someone that just disagrees with us. See, we don't always get along with everybody. And to some extent, that's okay. Some of that is our personalities. I remember in college, there was a guy who I can tell you a little bit about because we're friends now. But at the time in college, I didn't like him at all. And we're going to call him George. It's not his real name, but we're going to call him George today, okay? And George came in my second semester, so I didn't really know him. He came in later than all the rest of us. He wasn't a part of our orientation. But the way that George was wired was just different. He loved to play practical jokes on people, whether they wanted the practical joke played on them or not. He was the guy that tied the strings of every doorknob in the dorms on my floor, all right, and tied them all together so that no one would be able to get out. All right. Luckily, we had a guy that was like super strong, and all he did was go like this really hard, and it broke everything. All right, but George, he just didn't get along with me. He didn't get along with the guys that I ran with, but George wasn't my enemy. Yeah, I didn't like him. Yeah, we disagree on a number of issues, but he's not my enemy. And just because my likes were different than his likes, and just because you may like fishing and this person over here likes video games, it doesn't mean that we are enemies. And we have to ask that question, who then is our enemy? And I think that most people in this world, they're not our enemies. Most people in this world, they're not out there trying to seek our harm. Most people in this world want to live their lives how they want to live it, and yes, that means they sin, but just because they're sinners doesn't mean that they're our enemies. And we have to be aware of that. Enemies are seeking to bring harm into our lives. Enemies are not just content with harming us. They're seeking other people to cause harm on us. And yes, I think that we do have enemies. There are people out there that do that are seeking to bring us down. But not everyone falls into that category. And I think ultimately, the ultimate enemy that we have is Satan, is the devil. And I think the devil wants us to be so distracted with everyone else that we forget that there are some people that are still with us, that are still open to what we have to say, and then there are those that are truly our enemies. And if we treat everyone like our enemy, then we build this wall that keeps people from coming to know who Jesus is. And so we have to distinguish those who are our enemies and those who just are not on our side. And there's a difference between those. And so if we can figure out who our enemies are, if we can figure that out, then we can look at David's reaction to everything that Saul has done in chapters 18 and 19, and we can see how we should live with our enemies. I think David's reaction is not to seek revenge. In the next couple of chapters, David will have two opportunities to kill Saul. And Saul deserved death, right? Because Saul had tried to kill David and had ordered people to kill David. And so David had every right to take vengeance. And more often than not, we want to be vengeful. We want revenge. We want the harm that's been done to us to be repeated on other people. But Paul says it best when he clarifies in Romans 12 what our attitude towards vengeance should be. And he says this: do not take revenge. The attitude of Christians should not be to be vengeful. It should not be to take revenge. And he says the reason why we don't take vengeance is because we leave room for God's wrath. God is going to take care of it. And he quotes Deuteronomy, which says, "It is mine to revenge, I will repay." See, from the very beginning, God's people was not supposed to take vengeance. The government had laws in place to take care of bad things that happen. When people cause harm to you, the laws are there to take care of it. It is not your job to take it into your hands. And so David, he doesn't take vengeance on Saul. Instead, he shows two actions that we should emulate in our lives. All right, the first one comes in 1 Samuel chapter 24. And there we see that David has his opportunity to kill Saul, but instead he shows mercy. And as Christians, we need to show mercy to our enemies. David is one step ahead of Saul. Saul is seeking him out. He's chasing after David, trying to kill him. David and a small group of men that are with them, they end up hiding in the caves. In Israel, the place is littered with caves that people over time have hidden in to get away. And so David's hiding in one of these caves, and we see this happen in verses 3 and 4. It says, Saul came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. He went to use the restroom. David and his men were far back in the cave, and the men said, "This is the day that the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish." And David crept up, unnoticed, and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Saul goes into this cave to use the restroom, assuming that he's probably by himself, right? And so Saul is there by himself, no guards, and David has an opportunity, and his men are there saying, now is the time, now is the time. It can all be over. You can take your vengeance, and we can be done hiding in these caves. And David creeps up and simply cuts a piece of Saul's robe. In verses 5 and 6, we're told that David afterwards was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And David said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or to lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. And David's right. Saul was anointed, chosen by God. And David's reaction to all this is, how could I have done such a thing? And we think to ourselves, well, he tried killing you 3 times now. What do you mean, how could you do such a thing? But David, in this moment, shows Saul mercy. And he's ashamed that he would even harm an article of clothing that Saul has. See, mercy is this act of not giving what is deserved. Too often in life we want revenge. We want to get even. We want the harm that's been done to us to be placed back on the person. If no one else is going to do it, then I have to do it myself. But the reality is that is not how we should act as Christians. The reality is that's how children act. My children do it all the time, and it's something that we're trying to teach them that's not okay. Micah, he's a terror at times. All right, and he will go and he will take something that the girls had. Maybe it's a picture that they're drawing, or maybe it's a toy that they're playing with, and he'll just run away. And the girls, they start to scream at him, and they will chase after him. And when they catch him, do you know what they do? They bunch him. And if they can't catch him, they take one of his toys. And that's the reality, is that vengeance is childish. Vengeance is a sign that we have not grown up. My parents always told me to take the higher road. Don't do it back to them. My 5th grade boy in my 5th grade class said to me one time, 2 wrongs don't make a right, which was pretty ironic since he was the bully of the class, right? He was not wanting me to get back at him. But that's the point. Vengeance is childish. It is not ours to take care of. God will take care of it. And vengeance cannot be a part of our tool bag as Christians. Instead, we are to show mercy. David had every right to kill Saul, but David knew it was not right to kill Saul. And instead, David showed mercy to Saul. He comes out of the cave after Saul has gone away and says, Saul, look, I could have killed you, but I showed mercy. And Saul listens to David, and he admits right there on the spot, David, you are more righteous than I am. And Saul will leave David alone for a bit, but eventually we get back to Saul chasing David. And in chapter 26, we see this happen again, where Saul is after David, and David is one step ahead of him, just barely. And we see the second thing that David does, the second action that he has against his great enemy Saul, and that is this: he shows grace to his enemy. And as Christians, we must show not just mercy, but grace to them as well. In verses 3 through 5, we read this: Saul was coming, and he made camp beside the road on the hill of Hakilah, facing that town. But David stayed in the wilderness, and when he saw that Saul had followed him there, he sent out his scouts, and he learned that Saul had definitely arrived. And then David set out, and he went to the place where Saul is camped, and he saw where Saul and Abner, son of Ner, the commander of the army, had lain down, and Saul was laying inside the camp with the army encamped all around him. Saul is not just coming by himself. He is bringing his army. And David, by this time, has gathered a sizable crew with him as well. No longer can they just hide in the back of the caves. And so David takes proactive steps. He goes to where the camp is. He watches which tent that Saul goes into, because now is his chance. Now is the time to bring this to an end. And in verses 6 through 11, we read what David does. David then asked Ahimelech the Hittite and Abishai, son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, who will go down to the camp with me to Saul? And Abishai said, I will go with you. And so David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there was Saul laying asleep in the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. And Abner and the soldiers were lying around him. And Abishai said to David, today God has delivered your enemies into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't strike twice. Abishai already knows that David will not kill Saul. He's saying, David, let me kill him. And David said to Abishai, don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives, the Lord himself will strike him, or his time will come, and he will die, and he will go into battle, and he will perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Now get the spear and the water jug that are near his head, and let's go. Now, this is really a contrast, right, between Saul. When Saul was by himself, he tried to kill David at least 3 times. When Saul had other men with him, he ordered them to kill David at least 3 times. And every time that David comes to Saul, he is one by himself, and he says, I will not kill him. And then he's with someone else, and he does not allow them to kill him. And there's a contrast between characters. And David says, no. And David gives grace to Saul. See, grace is the act of giving what is not deserved. And in this case, Saul did not deserve to live. The men that have come around David, that are joined his company, they are all there for a reason. And they are there because Saul has done something against them. They didn't just flock to David because David had a great personality, although I'm sure that helped. They flocked to David because Saul was against them. And Abishai had every reason to also kill Saul. And he says to David, let me do it. And David says, no. We give him his life. And though Saul deserved to die, David gave him life instead. Not only are we to be merciful to our enemies and not repay evil with evil, but we are to be gracious to them. And when they are evil against us, we are to be good in return. We are to give kindness in return. And that's not easy. And it's not something we always want to do. When people hurt us, when people do things against us, when they cause pain in our lives, we want to get revenge. But God says, no, show them grace. When they are evil, be good. Seek their good. Be proactive. Don't just sit back and wait for a chance to, okay, maybe I'll be okay to them this time. No. Go. Find them. And seek their good. Christians are to show grace and mercy to their great enemies. So why does this matter? And I think the reason why it's important that we are merciful and that we are gracious to our enemies is because at one point in time, we were enemies of the Creator of the universe. At one point in time, we were separated from God because of the things that we had done against Him. At one point in time, our sin kept this divide between us and God, and we were enemies. And God showed us mercy. And God showed us grace. And God sent his Son to die the death that we deserve to die so that we could be one with him. Paul says in Romans 5:10 these words, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son. How much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? The enemies that we have as Christians for being faithful followers to God, they are God's enemies. We are the children of God, and anybody that's against us is against God. But the Jesus that died so that we could be one with God is the same Jesus that died for our enemies. He's the same Jesus that showed mercy and grace. And if Jesus showed mercy and grace to them, then we, as the hands and feet of Jesus, must show our enemies mercy and grace. We must be willing not to give them what they deserve, and we must be willing instead to give them kindness and goodness. That's what it means to be a great enemy. Let me pray for you. Heavenly Father, in our lives, there are those who are against us. There are those who are seeking our pain and our hurt. Lord, when we come across them, when we interact with them, I pray that we will not seek revenge, but we'll allow you to take care of that. I pray that we will show instead mercy and grace because you have shown us mercy and grace. Help us to remember the sacrifice of Jesus that allows us to be in the right standing with you. And it's the call of the gospel for that news to be shared with everyone, that anyone can come, even those who are our enemies. Help us to show this mercy and grace that the world desperately needs to know about. I ask this in your name. Amen.